Thank you again. Thank you again for your kind introduction and for everybody attending. I'm going to talk today about plans we've been developing over the last several years, actually since 2009, to transition the world and the US in addition to 100% clean renewable energy and storage for all purposes. And that includes electricity, transportation, buildings, industry, and everything else. So we're actually taking this approach a little differently from a lot of people who study climate, because we're looking at actually three problems simultaneously. There's air pollution, global warming, and energy security. 7 million people die from air pollution each year, including 20% are children under the age of 5 years old. It's the second leading cause of death. Based on statistical cost of life, it's about $30 trillion per year today in cost, and that's expected to go up continuously if we don't eliminate sources of air pollution. I mean, partly because population keeps increasing and emissions keep increasing, despite the fact that emission technologies are a little more efficient each year. On top of that, global warming compared with the 1850 to 1900 period is about 1.1 degrees higher, Celsius higher than 1850 to 1900 already. And if we don't eliminate 80% emissions by 2030 and 100% by 2035 to 2050, we expect that to get up to 1.5 degrees Celsius or higher. At that time, it's estimated that the world will be paying about $30 trillion per year from the impacts of global warming. Third, energy insecurity is a problem. I mean, one of the security problems is that fossil fuels are limited resources. They will run out eventually, and that will result in social, political, and economic instability. In addition, we have international transport of fuels, mining and transport of fuels. So some countries have strangleholds over other countries for fuels, as we can see, and blackmail can be used to try to prevent some countries from obtaining energy. In addition, transporting energy overseas, for example, to islands, results in really high costs of energy, up to 50 to 60 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity. Another energy insecurity problem is the fact that we have many centralized power plants and refineries, and when one of these goes down, that takes a large portion of the grid down, or production of fuels down. So these are all three drastic problems and require drastic solutions. So our solution is to electrify everything and then provide the electricity with just wind and water and solar. So the four major, well, first, we're going to be addressing here energy. And in terms of air pollution, energy is responsible for about 90 to 95% of air pollution problems and about 70% of climate problems. So we also have to address non-energy sources, which there are ways to do that. Non-energy sources include biomass burning, agriculture, so methane from cattle, the digestive tracts of sheep and cattle, from manure, from chicken and pig manure and cow and sheep manure, from rice paddies, also nitrous oxide from fertilizers, and halogen emissions. Those are all non-energy sources of emissions that need to be addressed as well. But I'm going to focus on energy here. In the main energy sectors, there's electricity, transportation, buildings, and industry. And for transportation, for example, we go primarily to battery electric vehicles. We'd use some hydrogen fuel cell for long distance heavy transport, like long distance ships, long distance aircraft, primarily, some long distance trucks and trains, but pretty much everything else is battery electric. For buildings, we'd go to electric heat pumps for air and water heating and air conditioning. We would use electric induction cooktops for cooking. There would be some solar, there'd be some district heating for buildings, which is where you have centralized heaters and chillers and then that hot and cold water is then piped around instead of having individual heaters and coolers in buildings. You know, right now, about 7% of the United States is under district heating. It's probably not going to increase very much. Let's say it goes to 10 to 20% possibly. It's a little more efficient to have district heating, but only in urban areas. And one type of district heating is geothermal heat. One source is geothermal heat, and solar heat can also be used for district heating. So we would have some direct heat sources with wind, water, solar, but otherwise it's mostly electricity. For industry, we would use electric arc furnaces, induction furnaces, resistance furnaces, dielectric heaters, electron beam heaters. These are all high temperature industrial processes. And we provide the electricity in all cases with onshore and offshore wind, solar photovoltaics on rooftops and in power plants, concentrated solar power, geothermal electricity, hydroelectricity, and small amounts of tidal and wave power. So we call all these electricity generating technologies and also the heat generating technologies, wind, water, and solar technologies. So in sum, we'd have wind, water, solar generation. We'd also have storage, which I'm going to talk about next. We'd have electricity, heat, cold, and hydrogen storage. And we would use demand response to help keep the grid stable and interconnected transmission and electrified appliances. That's a wind, water, solar system. So for electricity storage, we'd use concentrated solar power with storage, pumped hydroelectric storage, existing hydroelectric dams, batteries, flywheels, compressed air storage, and gravitational storage with solid masses. For heating and cooling, well, we'd use water tank storage for both hot and cold water. That's pretty low cost. Ice storage for cold, and then underground storage in boreholes, water pits, and aquifers, primarily for heat. And this is seasonal storage. You can store it up to 6 months, as well as building materials. And then we'd have some hydrogen storage. Well, you probably heard a lot about hydrogen lately. So there are good and bad sources of hydrogen. And I'm going to talk about those and also good and bad uses. So we're proponents only of green hydrogen, which is from wind, water, solar, electricity. So you need an electrolyzer basically running on electricity. Electricity passing through water produces hydrogen. Bad sources would be gray and blue hydrogen. Gray hydrogen is just natural gas, steam methane reforming, or autothermal reforming. Blue hydrogen is natural gas combined with carbon capture. Black and brown hydrogen are anthracite and lignite coal, respectively. Pink hydrogen is from nuclear electricity. Turquoise is methane pyrolysis. So we don't propose using those. For uses of hydrogen, pretty much only for long distance aircraft, ships, trains, trucks, some military vehicles using fuel cells, not combustion, and also ammonia and steel manufacturing, and electricity and heat with fuel cells for some remote microgrids, but not for passenger vehicles or other vehicles not listed, not to heat buildings, not for burning to heat buildings like natural gas. It's just way less efficient than heat pumps. And hydrogen fuel cells for passenger vehicles, much less efficient than batteries for passenger vehicles. Storing electricity for regular grid, that's also not useful. Partly because of the low efficiency of hydrogen going from an electrolyzer to storage to fuel cell. You need about 2.5 to 3 times the number of wind turbines and solar panels as you do for a battery. And although hydrogen storage is cheaper than battery storage, most people don't realize that, well, you really need to discharge the electricity from hydrogen to meet peaks in demand on the grid. And for meeting peaks in the demand, fuel cells themselves cost 2 to 3 to 4 times that of a battery. I mean, they're like $500 to $1,000 a kilowatt, whereas a battery is like $150 a kilowatt. So anyway, it's not very efficient for using for grid electricity, and it's not good for combustion. Maybe the only combustion application is maybe using, because right now hydrogen is used to propel rockets into space. And so that'll probably continue until we find, unless we can do fuel cells that way. But, I think that's kind of the last frontier of solving this problem. Okay, so let's, one application of hydrogen, can we use hydrogen for long distance aircraft? So we did a study looking at transitioning military vehicles, land, air, and sea military vehicles, and we also considered 747. I wanted to show you results. So in this study, we looked at trying to preserve 4 properties. One is mass, another is volume, another is range, and then either thrust to weight or power to weight ratio. And in the case of a 747, on the very bottom here, it shows results. I'll try to explain them really simply since it's not very easy to interpret here. But basically, we found that if you want a hydrogen fuel cell aircraft that gives you the same range and the same thrust to weight ratio as a jumbo jet 747, we could accomplish that with an aircraft that has 21% larger volume, but 22% less mass than a jet fuel aircraft. So that's good news. You cannot do it with a battery a jumbo jet based on published technologies, but you can do it with a hydrogen fuel cell aircraft. In fact, you can transition pretty much everything with hydrogen fuel cells. For small vehicles that are short distance in particular, batteries are always better, but there is a distance, a range for all vehicles at which hydrogen fuel cells become more advantageous. And that can be seen most clearly with 747s. Okay, so what about, well, so let's look a little bit about heating and storage. I mentioned district heating and cooling. So my university actually in 2016, it transitioned from 80% of the campus being powered for both electricity and heat by natural gas from a cogeneration plant to district heating and cooling system. The natural gas plant was bulldozed and replaced with this fourth generation district heating and cooling system. Actually, it's the first fourth generation heating and cooling system in the world. Fourth generation means it has both district heating and cooling. So there are two chillers and a boiler, and there are about 35 miles of hot water pipes and 35 miles of cold water pipes around the university. And there are electric heat pumps that are used to raise the temperature of the hot water and to lower the temperature of the cold water. And a lot of the waste heat because when you produce heat, you expel cold, and when you produce cold, you expel heat. There's some recycling of that going on to help reduce energy use. The university bought 150 or 160 megawatts of solar PV, put 10 megawatts on the campus on rooftops, and bought two power plants, or built two power plants in the California desert, or one in the Central Valley, one in the desert. Stanford then was actually 100% renewable for not only electricity, but also heating and cooling. Then one of the power plants actually burned down. One of the photovoltaic plants burned down during a fire. But that was recently replaced. And so, but now it's 100% renewable again for electricity, heating, and cooling. But not for like vehicles. Or some vehicles that are not electrified. And there's a bunch of backup diesel generators on the campus in case things go down. There are like 250 diesel generators. These need to be removed. Anyway, the goal is eventually to get rid of all sources of fossil fuels on the campus. Here's another example of a district heating system. This is Okotoks, Canada. There are 52 homes built in 2004 and 5 on the top left. On the rooftops of the garages, these solar collectors were placed. There's a glycol solution inside the solar collectors. During the summer, when the days are very long, this glycol solution collects heat from the sun. The heat is then piped to this building on the right, where the heat is transferred to water. The water is then piped through U-shaped pipes underground, down about 30 meters underground. The heat is transferred to the soil, which has been insulated, and that the soil heats up, and the heat is stored from summer till winter. When the whole system is run in reverse, when the snow is on the ground, like on the bottom left, and the heating from this underground storage provides 100% of the wintertime heating for these 52 homes. The cost of the heating storage is less than $1 a kilowatt hour, which compares again with batteries, which are about $150 a kilowatt hour. So it's very inexpensive storage. The round trip efficiency from summer to winter is about 56%. So it's not extremely efficient, but at that low cost, you don't need to be extremely efficient. Here's another example of a district heating. This is in Denmark, where they have several of these systems in Scandinavian countries where you have it's called water pit storage. So there's a big swimming pool-like structure filled with water and then covered with insulation. And then these solar collectors during the summer basically heat the water up to 80 degrees Celsius. And that water is then stored until wintertime and used to provide heat for this town of Vojens, which has about 2,500 buildings. And one more district heating or cooling system. This is ice storage. Actually, Stanford, starting in 1998, had a big ice cube under a building. similar to this. And during the night, when electricity prices were low, electricity was used to produce ice. And then during the day, instead of running air conditioning, water is run through coils in the ice and then transferred to buildings to heat the buildings. So this is ice storage, and it's used quite a bit in stadiums and hospitals and other types of facilities. And it's about $40 a kilowatt hour, but it basically displaces electricity use. So it's like battery storage, but it's much cheaper than battery storage. I want to talk briefly before I look at the world plans we've developed. I want to talk about transitioning an individual home to wind, water, and solar without natural gas or any other fossil fuel. And so I'm going to actually talk about my own home that I built in 2017. And it has no gas on the property. It has solar photovoltaics on the rooftop. It has 4 first-generation Tesla wall mount batteries. Each discharges at a peak discharge rate of 3.3 kilowatts and has about 2 hours of storage at the peak discharge rate. So it's about 6.6 kilowatt hours of storage each. So total discharge rate among the 4 batteries is around 13.2 kilowatts and 26.4 kilowatt hours of storage. There also have a couple electric cars, and the solar system is about 13.6 kilowatts. There are a couple inverters. There are electric heat pumps. These are called ductless mini split heat pumps used for air heating and air conditioning. So they're ductless, so they don't have big ducts. They actually have individual units, like on the left, in each major room of the house. So there are about 9 of these units around the house. There are 2 outside units, so there are 4 or 5 inside units connected to each outside unit. So heat pumps don't create heat or destroy it, they just move it around. So they extract heat out of the air in this case and move it to the room, or they extract cold out of the air because they run in reverse as air conditioners. So you can have a ground source heat pump, which you might want on the East Coast, where when you get snow, we don't get snow here where I live. So ground source heat pump. Now there are companies that build really nice ground source heat pumps really inexpensively, like Dandelion in New York, where they drill 2 holes in the ground, really narrow holes, and you actually extract the heat from the underground, and it's stable. The temperature under the ground is much more stable than in the air, so it's pretty warm even when there's snow on the ground. Or you can have a water source heat pump. Anyway, this is very efficient. It uses 1/4 the energy as a natural gas heater. I have a perfect temperature inside for the last 5 years, and or almost 6 years now, and I have no complaints. It hardly uses any energy. For water heating, I also have a heat pump water heater. This one extracts the heat from the room that it sits in, a mechanical room. So the temperature of the room drops a couple degrees, which is fine during the summer. I just open the door and it helps cool the house. But the water is really hot when I need it, and it's extremely efficient. Uses 1/4 the energy as a gas heater, never breaks down. Very low. It's low cost overall when you account for the energy savings. So I have no complaints. For cooking, I use an electric induction cooktop. This boils water in half the time as natural gas. It's not the same as an electric resistance stove. It operates with pots or pans that have a resistive base, such as aluminum or stainless steel. Iron or stainless steel has to be resistive, and because it operates by electric induction, so an electric current in the stove induces a current in the pot or the pan, and because of the resistance dissipates the current into heat and heats the pot or the pan. So as a result, even it boils water in half the time as natural gas, but even when you're boiling water, the stove is not hot, it's just warm. So you can actually touch the stove or put your face on the stove, and it's not going to burn your face even if you put it on. So it's really nice and convenient and safe. On the left, I show an individual burner, and I show that burner could cost anywhere from $30 to $80. So in developing countries, I mentioned, worldwide, 7 million people die from air pollution, including about 2 to 3 million indoor air pollution from burning fuels for heating and cooking, like biofuels and coal. And so an easy way to fix that problem, well, technically easy, is to replace the cooking with induction. With one burner like this, it's really inexpensive. You just need an electricity source. So combining with some solar and batteries for a community, you can probably power a lot of indoor cooking. Anyway, that's good news that there are techniques to get rid of a lot of the combustion that results in air pollution and climate problems. So over the first 5 years of energy use, I generated 120% of all my home and vehicle energy use with the solar. I had no electric bill, no natural gas bill or gasoline bill. And I also, the extra 20% I sold back to my community choice aggregation utility for an average of $860 a year. And so this just shows the savings. I also avoided a gas hookup fee of about $6,000. Here I'm showing a range of typical homes. I avoided about $10,000 in gas pipes, and then I avoided electric, gasoline, and natural gas bills. So for a typical person, you might avoid $5,000 to $23,000 up front and $3,000 to $10,000 a year. Plus, you get paid for the extra electricity in a lot of places. So the overall payback time, and I had some subsidies too, the payback time with subsidies was 5 years. So I've already paid back this entire solar battery system. And without subsidy, it would be a 10-year payback, but the solar is warranted for 25 years. And so I think it's a no-brainer. It's very efficient, saves money. So basically, I will have no more electricity bill and will just make money for the next 20 years with my electricity if I live that long. So here's an example of my electricity consumption on the hottest day of the year in 2020, September 6th. It was 106 degrees Fahrenheit outside. I maintained the inside temperature at 77 degrees Fahrenheit with the heat pumps. This shows my electricity use on that day. The green is the solar production. I mean, coincidentally, usually on the hottest days, you have the most sunlight, so that's a good thing. The blue during the day is electricity consumption, mostly for the heat pumps, but also for other stuff. And then after the sun goes down, that's the battery kicking in. The blue is the battery kicking in to provide electricity. Once the battery is exhausted, the grid comes in, so that's the red. But on that day, I produced 60 kilowatt hours. I consumed 45 kilowatt hours, so I produced 15 more kilowatt hours than I consumed and sent the rest back to the grid. So it helped avoid blackouts on the grid. And this, so if everybody did this, we would not have blackouts in California. In California during the summer, the electricity consumption is twice as much as during any other time of the year. So that's when we get blackouts, especially in the late afternoons, early evenings. And so you can imagine, well, if we have a lot of solar on the grid in California, which we do, then when the sun goes down, we'll need more energy. And so people say, well, that's why you need natural gas. Well, it's not true, because it turns out that offshore wind actually peaks in the summers. As you can see from this graph, this is data, well, it's from modeling, but validated by data of the offshore winds off the Cape Mendocino in Northern California. And you can see that July wind speeds are much higher than January or April or October wind speeds. And not only that, the wind speeds, there's a peak right after sunset. So offshore wind is very complementary to solving this problem of providing California with 100% wind, water, and solar. Anyway, so let's move on to talk about, well, can we power the whole world with just wind, water, and solar for all purposes? And so we developed plans, energy plans for 145 countries. And then we broke up those 145 countries into 24 world regions and did grid stability analyses for those regions. We did the same thing for all 50 US states, and then broke up the US into its actual grid regions and did grid stability analyses for each region and many of the individual states. But first, worldwide, in 2018, the end use power demand for all purposes, and this is what people actually used for energy, was about 13 trillion watts. And that's expected to go up to 20.4 trillion watts by 2050 in a business as usual case. But if we electrify all energy and provide that electricity with wind, water, and solar, the energy demand goes down about 56% to 8.9 terawatts for 5 reasons. One is because battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are much more efficient than internal combustion engine vehicles. Their electrified industry is a little bit more efficient than fossil fuel industry. Heat pumps are more efficient than natural gas or other types of heaters. And then we eliminate all the energy needed to mine, transport, and refine fossil fuels and uranium, which is about 11.3% of all energy worldwide. And then we think we can squeeze another 6 to 7% energy efficiency improvements beyond business as usual. So that adds up to 56%. This shows graphically the same thing over time. If we start, let's say in 2020 and go to 2050, if we don't do anything, we go by the top line up to 20.4 terawatts. If we electrify and provide the electricity with wind, water, solar, then our demand goes down to 8.9 terawatts for those 5 reasons I just mentioned. And then we provide that 8.9 terawatts with just wind, water, and solar, as shown. This graph shows 80% transition by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And that's basically what we need to avoid 1.5 degrees global warming. However, if we can transition 80% by 2030, there's really no reason we shouldn't be able to get 100% by 2035. And that's what, excuse me, that's what this diagram shows. 100% transition by 2035 with the same endpoints by 2050. So that mix in 2050 for wind, water, solar, I'll show you here in more detail. And this is an average over all 145 countries. So each country has a different mix, but it's about 32% onshore wind, 13% offshore, 16% rooftop PV, 30% utility PV, 3% CSP, 1% geothermal electricity, 5% hydro, which all exist, by the way, already, and then small amounts of tidal wave and geothermal and solar heat. For the US, it's a slightly different mix, 28% onshore, 16% offshore, 21% roof PV, 31% utility PV, 0.4% CSP, 0.5% geothermal electricity, 3% hydro, which all exists, and then small amounts of tidal wave. And for this simulation, we didn't include geothermal heat and solar heat aside from geothermal heat for heat pumps. We didn't include it for district heating, but that was just an assumption for that simulation. So you might ask, well, how much land does this all take? For the world, well, offshore wind does not take up any new land. Tidal wave do not take up land. Rooftop PV does not take up new land. We don't add any new hydro, so there's no new land for that. Geothermal additions are small. So it's really utility PV and CSP, which take up about 0.17% of the world's land in these plans. And that's what we call footprint, because it's actually land on the ground that can't be used for anything else generally. Although maybe it can, if you can put it, you can maybe hang the solar over crops. You might be able to grow crops on them. But anyway, this assumes you can't. And then 0.36% for onshore wind. And that's spacing between wind turbines that can be used for multiple purposes, such as rangeland or farmland or open space or forest, or it could be used even to put solar on that land. So 0.53% for the US, it's 0.55% for onshore wind and 0.3% for utility PV, so 0.84%. For comparison, the fossil fuel industry occupies about 1.3% of US land area. So we think that we're actually reducing land requirements by going from fossil fuels to entirely wind, water, solar. So we checked in each of the 24 world regions and each region in the US whether we can keep the grid stable. We did it every 30 seconds for 2 to 3 years. And this is a US simulation for the RFC grid, which is reliability first, which is kind of a Midwest, northern Midwest US, and kind of Northeast, Northeast US. And so to run these simulations, so most of my work has been computer modeling, building air pollution, weather, and climate models over the last 30 years. So I built my own weather prediction and climate model, and from that, I was able to predict the winds every 30 seconds for several years everywhere in the world, and also solar fields as well. So I can capture the intermittency of the winds at a 30-second resolution everywhere in solar fields. And then combine that with projections of electricity demand with 100% renewables, as well as heat demand and cold demand and hydrogen production demand. And also using demand response and storage in another model I built, which is a grid model, basically. And I found that it's possible not only in the US in every region, but also in every region worldwide to keep the grid stable at low cost 100% of the time with just wind, water, and solar and storage and demand response, with no need for nuclear power, carbon capture, biofuels, or even long-term energy storage. These are all I use for storage. For electricity storage, I use 4-hour batteries, hydropower, existing hydropower, pumped hydropower storage, and some concentrated solar power storage. So you might ask, well, what's the cost of energy to keep the grid stable? Well, worldwide, the capital cost is about $62 trillion to transition everything to wind, water, solar. So that's what I call the Green New Deal cost for the world, capital cost. And the average cost of electricity is 8.5 cents a kilowatt hour. In the US, it's 9 cents a kilowatt hour and about $9 trillion upfront capital cost. For China, it's about $13 trillion upfront capital, 7.6 cents a kilowatt hour. But really what's relevant is the annual cost of energy of wind, water, solar versus business as usual. So business as usual fuels, well, today, the world energy cost is about $11 trillion per year. By 2050, that's estimated to go up to $18 trillion per year. But health costs are another 34, climate costs another 32. So the total social cost of energy is $83 trillion per year. But with wind, water, solar, we decrease the energy requirements by 56%, as I discussed before, plus the cost per unit energy goes down another 15%. So we get a 63% energy cost reduction down to 6.6 trillion a year. And that's, since we eliminate health and climate costs from energy with wind, water, solar, our social costs go down from 83 to 6.6 trillion per year. That's 92%. So 63% reduction of annual energy costs, 92% reduction of annual social costs. I think it's pretty obvious that this is what we should do. Okay, the last part of this talk is just on policies and where we are. Just a little history on this. So in 2009, we developed our first energy plan for 100% wind, water, solar throughout the world. And that was a paper that Mark Jacobson and I did that got published in Scientific American. And the paper was really a thought paper. Is it possible to, from a technical and economic point of view, to transition the world to 100% wind, water, solar by 2030? And this was back in 2009. And the conclusion was, well, yes, it's technically and economically possible, but it's unlikely to happen for social and political reasons. So maybe a more practical timeline is 80% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. Little did we know that this paper would be the scientific basis for the Green New Deal, which is a policy proposal in the US to transition the US to entirely 100% renewable energy by 2030, which has, by the way, never been voted on. There have been 8 proposed laws and resolutions in the US House and Senate since 2015, and none has been voted on. These are all to go to 100% renewables. But there are 62 countries that have policies or laws to go to 100% renewables, mostly smaller countries. There's some bigger ones like Germany and Spain and Denmark. Denmark is actually the only country to have, this is for for electricity, to transition to 100% renewable electricity. And these are all by different dates for each country. But only Denmark has passed a law to go to 100% renewable for all energy sectors. And I should point out that of world emissions, the emissions from China are equivalent to the emissions of 120 countries combined, of the smallest emitting countries. So having 62 countries committing to 100% renewables, while they represent a decent portion of total emissions, they're not nearly as, they're only a portion of China's emissions, for example, all combined. And so we really need, China has on the order of 30% emission of the world's emissions, and then there are 10 countries that have another 30%, 35, 40%, and then the remaining, the bulk of the countries, close to 190 countries, have about a third of the emissions. So we really need all countries on board. Now, there are 16 countries, and then there's some in states that are near or above 100% annual electricity generation or consumption from wind, water, solar. So, for example, Iceland, Norway, Costa Rica, Paraguay, Albania, Bhutan, Nepal, Ethiopia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo all generate 100% of their electricity that's generated in the country from wind, water, solar. All of them are dominated by hydro, with some with geothermal or wind, and some with solar as the second source. Kenya, Tajikistan, and Namibia are all greater than 91% wind, water, solar. Kenya is mostly geothermal. The second major source is hydro, and the others are hydro. But in the US, it's interesting. South Dakota actually generates 120% of its electricity consumed with wind, water, solar. 77% of that is wind, and the rest is hydro. Now, it also produces fossil fuels, so it's producing actually about 200% of its consumption, and it's exporting the difference. But the point is, if you just look at the consumption and the annual amount of wind and hydro produced in South Dakota, it's actually equivalent to 120% of its consumption. In Washington State, wind, water, solar is equivalent to 98% of the consumption in the state. In Scotland, it's about 91 or 92%. And Montana is also 92% of its consumption is wind, water, solar. So there's progress. Again, that's only electricity, and electricity is only 20% of end-use energy. There are 18 states and territories in the US that have laws or executive orders to go to 100% renewables in the electric power sector, including Washington, D.C. by 2032, Rhode Island by 2033, Connecticut, New York, and Oregon by 2040, Hawaii, California, New Mexico, and Washington State by 2045, and the rest by 2050. So that's progress. There are 180 US cities that are committed to 100% renewables by different years, and the ones in blue are larger cities. The ones in red are kind of smaller cities, but those are big commitments that are actually helpful. There are 380 international companies that have 100% goals to go to 100% renewables in their global operations, including 8 out of the 10 biggest companies in the world, which are the ones in blue. And so these companies are actually building solar and wind farms and battery storage facilities and purchasing electric vehicles. So they're actually helping a lot in moving the world to 100% renewables. Okay, so just to summarize everything I've talked about, I didn't mention jobs, but I will here. Worldwide, we find that we can create 28 million more long-term full-time jobs than lost. As I mentioned, in the US, it's about 3 to 4 million more long-term full-time jobs than lost. We'd require about 0.53% of world land for footprint and spacing. We'd avoid 7 million air pollution deaths by a transition, slower than reverse global warming. We can keep the grid stable throughout the world with 100%. The absolute energy costs or annual energy costs are 63% lower with wind, water, solar, and social costs are 92% lower. And finally, if you want more information, this new book is coming out this week, actually called No Miracles Needed, which is kind of a general book on how we can transition the world to 100% renewables and wind, water, solar for all purposes without the need for miracle technologies such as carbon capture, direct air capture, blue hydrogen, nuclear power, or bioenergy. And then the second link is the actual plans that we've been developing for the last 14 years. And the third link is an online course on 100% wind, water, solar that is extracted from a course I teach at Stanford. And then this last link is to infographic map. So actually a map of the world in the US where you can click on a state or country to find the energy plan for that region. So with that, I will stop and try to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We really do appreciate you presenting and sharing your insights with us. There are quite a number of questions. Let's see. So I'll try to get through some logistical ones. Would you be okay with this recording being shared with an MIT D-Lab course.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm happy to. My job is to try to inform people about what we learn. So I'm happy to have everything. You're welcome to the slides, and
Great.
Happy to have the recording spread out.
Super. So let's see. Let's start with someone asked about, is it possible in the future to obtain green hydrogen directly from the ocean economically, as the scarcity of water creates an issue for massive conversion to H2, especially along deserts where there's plenty of intensive sunlight for photovoltaic projects, but almost no fresh water?
I think actually electrolysis is more efficient when there's salt in the water. So I don't know, you probably have to purify it. I don't know how much you'd have to purify the ocean water, but I think it's actually more efficient. The electrolysis process is more efficient with salt water.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Someone else asked, we recently signed up for community solar, which required a 20-year contract reflecting the life of the panels. What is the prospect of recycling these panels at the end of the life cycle?
They're good. I think solar panels can be recycled, and especially companies are taking more responsibility to recycle. Batteries are definitely being recycled. Like Sonnen is a company that builds batteries, really efficient batteries with 15,000 cycle lifetimes, but they recycle 100% of the batteries. There's a company.
So there's been a shift since solar, first rooftop solar first came out, because it sounds like people are much more conscious about saving materials and recycling.
Yeah, in fact, there's a company called Redwood Materials that they take batteries, and they probably take solar now, and they recycle like 97% of the components of batteries as well. And I'm sure they'll do the same with solar, because there's a definite market for the materials. So it seems like logical that companies would do this.
Great. Let's see, what else? Short question. Was Ukraine one of the 145 countries that were studied as part of the 100% renewable power for the world?
Yes. Yeah, we did a plan for Ukraine as well. At least it was based on the energy from 2018, which was before the war.
Okay. And I had a question about pumped hydro storage. And when I was going through the draft scoping plan for New York, I thought, well, New York State would be a good case with Lake Erie and Lake Ontario to use pumped hydro storage, to maybe reduce the amount of batteries needed.
Well, existing pumped hydro is definitely very efficient. I mean, it's really efficient and cost effective. I mean, the problem going forward with pumped hydro is just getting permitting. I think in terms of its efficiency, I mean, there are a lot of places in the world where you can do pumped hydro. In fact, there was a study that said you could pretty much do all storage with pumped hydro. But the key is trying to get the permits. And I think it's just a lot easier to get permits for batteries than it is for pumped hydro.
And then on the topic of hydro, given that, the best we can do is limit the amount of carbon dioxide going up and stop increasing it and get it slowly to come down. We're facing a lot of severe weather events in our future, for coming decades, and droughts. And so do we need to build more hydropower to offset perhaps, problems with Hoover Dam and such, where Lake Mead is is drying up and things of that sort?
Yeah, well, there are, like in the US, there are I think it was like close to 85,000 dams, but only 3% have hydropower on them. So there are a lot of people who want to remove dams. So first thing, if people want to remove dams, I would suggest removing the ones that do not have hydropower associated with them. And then some of the existing dams could be either uprated. If you have hydro on existing dams, I mean, we've proposed uprating them. So you actually add more turbines to the existing dams to make them, you can use them more efficiently for meeting peaks in demand. And you could add turbines to some existing dams as well. It's going to be hard to permit like new dams for hydro, but using existing dams and uprating existing hydro or adding hydro electricity to existing dams, I think that's possible. But the thing about, when there's droughts, we just had like a huge amount of rain in California, but before that we had this huge drought where hydro levels went down quite a bit. But when there's low hydro, there's usually actually a lot of sunlight. So we had a lot more sunlight than usual. So that's a nice complementary thing about wind, water, and solar. When it's not windy, it's often sunny, and vice versa. When you have a lot of sunshine, maybe you don't have as much water for the dams, but you have more sunshines. And in California, like we could, even though we had less hydro in California, we imported a lot of hydro from Oregon, Washington, and Canada even. And so there's still a lot of hydro coming in. So it's really having a good interconnected transmission system that helps when you have bad weather events.
Thanks. Let's see, there's one question that was asked kind of twice. So I think I'll do the more recent ask. What is the prospect of converting a full country in each state to wind and solar production? I expect generational judicial struggles, a trouncing of any political leadership who tried to get it through. I know of no precedent suggesting it could be possible. So this is a political question. How do you deal with that?
Well, as I mentioned, in the US, there are 18 states and territories that have passed laws to go to 100% renewables effectively, but in electric power. So the next step is to try to electrify buildings. So there are a lot of laws actually in cities and around the country. A lot of them, at least 40 or 50 cities in California ban natural gas in new construction homes, for example. And then there are a lot of places moving towards electric cars. In California, for example, I think is supposed to have all electric cars, new cars by 2035. So slowly there are these laws being passed in regionally, statewide, but not necessarily in the US. Good thing, even in states that don't have laws, the states that don't have laws are actually, some of them actually have the highest penetration of renewables because it's so cheap, like Iowa, South Dakota, as I mentioned. A lot of these Midwestern states have a huge amount of wind without any regulations promoting it. So that's a good thing. But I think in order to get a transition, the large scale transition we need more policies in place, aggressive policies, and that's just going to require willpower, collective willpower of people. And part of that's education. Once people are aware of the benefits, nobody's going to turn down making more money and saving money. And that's why it's actually taking off in a lot of places without policies, but we do need policies to speed it up.
Right. And one of the things this group meets, monthly to discuss is how do you address, the pushback that some utilities and other places give, and in particular the driving this idea that we could use these methane pipelines for hydrogen into everybody's home, all these crazy ideas. And so we're interested in being able to put sensible literature out there and inform the public and say, look, it's time to stop this nonsense. And so the wealth of data you have and the facts, I think, would help us put something like that together. But these things have to be fought at the local level, to stop this kind of nonsense, so that good policy can be enacted.
Yeah, that's true. It is actually all levels: local, regional, state.
Going. I think this is when I finish dog sitting. Okay.
Sure. Sorry about that.
So I think local level definitely, but it's education and informing people, and then because if somebody makes a proposal about, let's say, hydrogen going through pipelines, most people are not going to know the difference, whether it's good or bad,
right? And
what the implications. But I can say that heat pumps are way more efficient. They're use 1/4 the energy, and plus you don't burn anything if you have solar electricity, for example, powering the heat pump. And as a result, it's cleaner from an air pollution point of view. It's more efficient. It costs less. You don't need pipes. You don't need the infrastructure.
Right.
It's just, and plus, just hydrogen going through a natural gas pipe. If you had 100% hydrogen, methane leaks on the order of 2.5% from pipes, just from not even counting the wells. Just from distribution pipes, methane leaks about 2.5%. Hydrogen, based on NREL's analyses, has it's a much smaller molecule. It's a molecular weight of 2 versus methane has a molecular weight of 16. And so it's 1/8 the size, but it has about 7 times, so it leaks at about a 7 times higher rate than methane. So you'd be getting like, talking about 14, 15, 16% leakage rate for hydrogen if it went in pipes.
Yep. I think I got two more questions here written, and then I'll let Diane ask. She's got her hand raised. So let's see, we've got one. We're working in Maryland on increasing our offshore wind. We were told it would take 10 years to build the transmission infrastructure that will be needed. Does that seem like a reasonable estimate?
I mean, it shouldn't be. I mean, offshore wind, the transmission line itself is basically a straight shot under the ocean floor. So the construction time is very short. I think that time is probably the permitting time that might be referred to, and maybe to deal with lawsuits or something like that. But I mean, the construction, planning to operation time of onshore wind is 1 to 3 years. So that includes the transmission. So really, there's no reason offshore wind should be more than that. It should be 1 to 3 years. But that's between planning and operation. That's not, the construction time itself is like 1 year or less, sometimes 4 or 5 months. So it should be less than 3 years for everything. But I think because it hasn't been done, there's only like 6 offshore wind turbines in the entire US. And so since there's no large scale apparatus in place, it's, everything is kind of taking longer as the first big farm.
Thanks. The last question is, some people believe that nuclear fission will be needed in the interim because of the political and social delays to implement wind, water, solar fully. What are your thoughts on this? I think you kind of shared that, but I'll let you say it again.
Well, I mean, in the US, there's one nuclear plant being built, and it's on 2 reactors in Georgia and Vogtle plant, and they're on years 17 and 18 respectively between planning and operation, and they're costing $34 billion for 2.2 gigawatts. So that's $15.2 a watt compared to $1 a watt for wind and solar. So why would you wait like an extra 14, 15 years for something that costs 7 to 8 times more per unit energy? It just makes no sense. And so, yeah, it's a non-starter. I mean, we need 80% of the problem solved by 2030 in 7 years. And if you have a technology that can't even be put up in 17 years, then it's just useless for helping solve the problem, regardless of all the other problems associated with it.
Okay, thanks. Diane, and then Shill.
Hi, great presentation.
Thank you.
I was wondering how you came up with the numbers of how much offshore wind we needed. Was that based on the need to meet the generation?
Yeah. So you mean for the United States or worldwide?
For the world, either way.
Well, we did each country individually. We first did a resource analysis for each country saying, well, what's the maximum you can put? And then we did a mixture. We then did estimates because we wanted to have a mixture of solar, wind, and the wind would be on and offshore. Onshore is generally less expensive than offshore, is usually a little more expensive, but onshore takes up more land than offshore. So there's kind of a trade-off. So we just went country by country and came up with an estimated mix that fit some constraints we had. And then we did check to see if we can keep the grid stable with that mix. And then we checked the cost of energy resulting. So that's just one possible mix. There are many other possible mixes too. We could have some other mixes that have more offshore wind and some that have less offshore wind. So fortunately, there are actually many options.
Because I mean, to sort of follow up with the other question about building them, I started working as an energy consultant in 2005 and did the first New England study of offshore wind and was working on Cape Wind. Here we are in 2023, and we still only have 6 turbines. So the rate at which we'd have to put offshore wind turbines to satisfy your model would be how many per year? And that's the part that I'm a little concerned about.
Yeah, well, so our plan is actually, it's not stating what's going to happen. It's basically stating what we need, or one plan of what we need to actually solve the problem. So whether we do it or not depends on political willpower and getting people agreeable. If you look at Europe, I mean, they're building huge amounts of offshore wind in China. I mean, China built an offshore wind farm, there's one farm it constructed in 4 months. I mean, so you can definitely do it if we put our mind to it. And in China, you can put up a transmission line from, 500-mile transmission line they could put up in 2 months. So it's because it all depends on, the bureaucracy you're facing to get through it. So if we decide we want to do it, there's sure going to be constraints, and transmission is one constraint where it's hard to, there's zoning issues. But we really have to decide to do that and make that a priority. It's not just, so our plans are not saying what's going to happen, they're saying what we need to happen in order for this to work.
Yeah, but there's also the construction of actually making all those offshore wind turbines in order to install them. So to me, I feel like we need to look at that aspect too, because that's a huge, I love offshore wind, but I'm impressed by how much offshore wind. Yay for offshore wind. I'll have to look at your model.
Well, I think the plan has been to actually construct these turbines in the US. So they're actually, for onshore wind, for example, there are a lot of factories that have sprung up in the Great Plains to build turbines for the Midwest. But so that's the same thing we'll need for offshore wind, because the plan is actually to build the number of offshore wind farms that have been proposed and are in the planning phase right now is tremendous in the US, but nothing's being built, as you said.
Okay. There was another question I missed, and then I'll let Shil ask his. But in the pricing for electricity per kilowatt hour for wind, water, solar, is the battery storage included in that?
Yes, yeah, it is.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's based on an estimated 2035 cost of batteries. I think it's down to about $60 a watt by then, because we're looking at the cost, between now and 2050 for this whole system.
Thanks. Okay, Shil.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that fantastic talk, Mark. And it's really a compelling argument that you make in this short talk, and obviously in your books as well. And it was great to hear about the successes that you talked about, the district heating at Stanford. And there are a number of groups that are talking about how do you replicate the successes, because there's so much chatter and so much noise in this discussion that it's very hard to project the successes clearly and loudly. And I think one of the major goals of Jeremy's group is to try to advocate for these the solutions that are really going to make a difference in future. So, like, even with the university, how do we convince a university like MIT to adopt the kind of solution that you've been able to do in Stanford?
Well, yeah, sometimes it comes from the students. There are active student groups that push these, but also from the faculty. But it really, actually, I think the key is to have somebody in the utilities division of the university who knows what they're doing. Like there are a couple of people in our utilities division who really were gung-ho about this and really pushed it along. And then there were students who also helped out and amplified it. And then there's some faculty that were helping out too. So it was kind of a groundswell of support, but driven a lot by but it really helped to have somebody who's actually in the utilities who knew what they were doing. So I don't know what MIT's situation is right now, but I would say that would be one of the things to consider, is try to talk to the utilities people to see if the utilities people will actually help out in this aspect.
So is there a program at Stanford to replicate the solutions that you've invented there? I guess with MIT they have obviously they have a plan as well, but with a lot of smaller schools, they're looking for the technical solutions. If they were given those technical solutions, they might be able to make a change much more rapidly. So is there any effort at Stanford to try to help other schools replicate some of the solutions that you've come up with?
I don't know if there is a specific effort. I think they've certainly made their information available for other schools. And there are, I think they have at the utility scale with different schools, they have meetings that they just trade information. I am I do know there are other schools that have come up with their own types of plans, not necessarily as aggressive, like UCLA or some, has a plan to put more solar, but they're not necessarily going to district heating, cooling, So I would say, but I find that it's really places where there's really a strong willpower within the university to make a change, that a change happens. If you have people who are just not so excited about it, it's not going to happen. That, I think, no matter how much information they have. And, it comes also down to funding, how where they're going to get the funding. So unfortunately, it's not like an easy fix, except if there's unless there's a law that's passed that requires them to do it, or there's enough pressure put on by students or alumni to make a change. But I mean, they can all do it. I mean, I've heard other universities making great strides. There are other ones that are, like in Australia, that are they say they're 100% renewable electricity now, and but there's a bunch of universities that made commitments. I think Cornell University made a big commitment to go to 100%. So I think I just encourage, this utilities division, the students, alumni, faculty to get on board. I think more will happen.
Thanks.
Okay, before Susan asks her question, I think is it okay to stop recording now? We are past the hour. So I'm going to stop the recording and